Well, I wrote out like a list of what I'm hoping to get out of it, and I feel like I have questions specific to each section. And then I'm really also hoping to get some advice on how to spend the rest of my time between now and November. So
yeah, sure. Yeah, fire away.
So for logic games, which right now is, I don't know if it's the most difficult section as much as I am making really silly mistakes on it, and I know I'm losing like points that I don't need to lose. So I'm getting stuck sometimes on like the second game or like the third game, like not a hard game, and I'm just sort of taking too much time, and I'm having trouble deciding when to like move on and when to really like stick with something and try and like get those points or not.
Yeah, sure. Well, you want to avoid getting bogged down in general on the LSAT because everything is worth the same. So on logical reasoning, this is easier to practice because you can flag a single question and hope to come back to it later. But on logic games, you are investing yourself in absorbing all the rules of the game. And so there is a big switching cost to leave one game behind and go on to the next. So the only suggestion I would really have for you is just improve your understanding of games in general to minimize the number of times this happens. There's not really any sort of quick fix for this.
Yeah, so it's worth like sticking with a game if you've invested enough time already.
Generally, yes. But what you can do is do the questions in an order that makes the most sense for you. And what I would recommend here is that you do the local questions before the global ones, so that you build up a library of hypothetical scenarios that you can use to more easily solve the global ones.
Yeah, okay, that makes a lot of sense. And then kind of in the same vein, I'm trying to strike a balance between spending the right amount of time, like before I even move on to the questions, like with my diagram, trying to make inferences, possibly making, multiple versions of the same diagram, or just moving right along to the questions. And I'm trying to figure out, what do you think is a good amount of time to spend diagramming if you think if you can ultimately come out of it with like worlds, kind of, different worlds, or when you think it's just you're spending way too much time, you need to move on?
I'd say typically the maximum would be 3 to 4 minutes.
Okay.
And the key is that you're making these worlds methodically and systematically, not that you're haphazardly drawing random diagrams, but that you are encompassing all possibilities and going down a couple of clear, solid roads.
Yeah, and just picking like whichever maybe the two most restricted variables are, and then sort of going down from there. That's what I'm doing now. Is that like the best way to approach if like making worlds? I find that, I mean, you know this, obviously when you like make worlds and you do it well, the questions you can be done in like 1 minute and it's perfect. So I feel like I try so hard to reach that scenario because I know that if I can do that, then the questions are going to go so much easier. But then I found myself like making worlds sometimes when you don't actually benefit from it. And I'm just trying to figure out how better to strike that balance. But I guess that just comes with more practice.
Yeah, some games lend themselves to this technique and others don't. And as you said, it's based on the particularly limited or limiting variables. If a game has those, it's amazing. If not, there's simply less work to do up front and more work to do over the course of the game.
Yeah, okay. And then I guess between now and November, what percentage of my logic game practice do you think should be on like what you call curveball games, and what should be on like regular standard games?
Well, the question would be based on where you currently are. So do you feel that you have a good, solid understanding of the basic game types?
Yeah, I think so.
In that case, then I would say you only need to do the minimum to stay fresh on those and spend more time on the curveball games. As for percentages, roughly, I would say maybe you want to spend 3/4 of your time on the more classic games that are more likely to appear, but also work through the curveball games. And I have a list of those I can send you just to shoot me an email. And it's a list of all the curveball games that have ever appeared. And if you really want to put yourself in the position where you're likely to score perfect on games, I would say do every game in that list.
Yeah, okay.
And I know there's only a couple of weeks until November, but you can mix it up a little bit, and maybe you're doing a timed exam or 2 per week, but on your off time, you could be focusing on these curveball games.
Yeah, I made a list. I don't know if it's complete, so I'll definitely email you about what list you have as well. But I've been working my way through the like kind of curveball games, and sometimes I'll go -0 and sometimes I'll go like -6. And it's just about like, I don't know, I have to find like consistency with that and hope and pray that I get an easy game section too. Okay, so for logical reasoning, I guess my biggest question, or the biggest thing I struggled with, I took the October test up until that point, was timing. I had done very little like timed practice. I was just sort of trying to figure out how to like approach logical reasoning. And I feel like I have that down now, but I'm sort of struggling with timing. And I don't know if looking at the clock is helping me or hurting me. So I guess, what are your thoughts on sort of specifically trying to time logical reasoning to do like 10 and 10 or 15 and 15 and then move on?
Yeah, I tend more towards 10 and 10 or
Mhm.
10 and 12 minutes as a good benchmark.
Okay.
I wouldn't ever time individual questions. That's unnecessarily nerve inducing. So I
Mhm.
would say just on an average, work through the easier questions more quickly, build up a time bank to do the tougher ones later in the section. Personally, I don't love that countdown clock on the digital LSAT.
Mhm.
I would, if I were taking it, I would remove that clock. You can just click it to make it go away until you hit the 5 minute mark, at which point you can no longer remove it. But I find it stress inducing. I would take it away and trust in the prep I've done up to this point that I have my own internal rhythm that keeps me reasonably on track. If you want to check at the when you've solved question 10, at that point, if you want to quickly check the time remaining to see if you're on track, you could do that, but I wouldn't do more than
Okay. The only question type that I'm still very consistently like struggling with, or I don't know, I can get the right answer, but it takes way too much time, are like the parallel flaw or parallel reasoning. And I'm trying to decide if those are just worth skipping in general. And if not, should I only do those should I flag them and come back to them at the end, which is that same type of question. And then also, because that question is giving me a lot of trouble, should I spend a lot of time drilling like by question type moving forward between now and November? Like, should I drill a bunch of those, or should I just do more timed practice in general?
that. I'll answer your last question first. I would do both. I would do time practice in general because your real exam is coming up.
Mhm.
But if you notice a particular trouble with flaw or parallel questions, then yeah, I would do a bunch of those to the side. And they're infrequent enough that drilling them becomes useful because you won't otherwise encounter a ton of them in a row.
Yeah.
Now,
Okay.
as for should you just flag them on site, personally, I wouldn't flag one that comes earlier in the section, like a number 9
Yeah.
is not going to be that difficult a method of reasoning. So
Mhm.
although it's a parallel type, if you can get the method of reasoning, it's really not such a bad question. But if it's number 19, then yeah, I might flag it on site. And typically I would flag 3 to 4 questions of this nature and come back to them at the end.
Okay.
But I would aim to move at a quick enough pace so that I will actually be able to come back to them at some point.
Yeah, come back to them. Okay. And then just for reading comprehension, I guess I'm just looking for general tips, and I'm going either -0 or -8, and it's never like in between. It's always really extreme or like a really good section. So I just don't know if, and typically if it's like a bad section, it's the science passage that's sort of messing me up, and it's just because I'm spending way too much time reading that, like just trying to get into the details. And I know that the details aren't important, but I don't know, any general like reading comprehension tips, especially around science passages and consistency.
Yeah, sure. So with any tough content on the LSAT, and I'm speaking primarily about something like science or philosophy in either reading comp or logical reasoning,
Mhm.
I try to dumb it down as much as possible. I will caricature or exaggerate the different parties or viewpoints expressed in the passage just to make them as simple as possible. So if I were going to caricature each group to the point that I could explain it to a 5-year-old, what would that look like?
Mhm.
Or I'll use an acronym or pick a keyword. Like there's one passage that comes to mind where they were discussing 2 different political groups. One was the Congress and one was the League. One was more moderate, one was more radical. And so I just put those terms on them, like Congress equals radical and League equals moderate, or whatever the case was for those different groups. And I hold on to my articulation or my paraphrase rather than the one given in the passage because they're purposely making it more difficult.
Yeah. Okay, that's good to know. And I've heard you say a couple times that like you don't really recommend highlighting or taking notes or anything. I don't do any of that at all, and I'm wondering if maybe with science that would help, or you think I should stick with not doing any of that. Like you were saying, even if it's small notes about like the general thing that I want to keep in mind, do you think that would be helpful, or do you think if I don't tend to take notes, I should not start doing that?
I think if you want to take a few minimal notes, that's totally fine. But I would typically limit those to the main idea, primary purpose, author's opinion, things of that nature. And so if I were to write down, again, Congress equals radical, League equals moderate, or whatever it is,
Mhm.
That's like 4 words and 2 equal signs. That's it. That's all I'm putting down. I'm not
Yeah.
trying to give lengthy summaries of each paragraph.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Okay. So then to move on to scheduling, I haven't done a lot of full practice tests. I'll be honest. I've only done 4, which is a huge problem. And I've done none in the 80s. So I guess in the next 2 weeks, I really need to like tackle the 80s. I'm wondering, I don't feel like I actually, maybe this is not true, but my feeling about it is that I don't really benefit that much from full pack practice tests. I feel like I don't have a problem with like the stamina of keeping up. I didn't have a problem with that at all on October. So I feel like when I do a full practice test, that limits my study time on like a weekend day to like those 3 hours or whatever, and then the review of it. Whereas if I didn't do a full practice test, I could do like a lot more than 4 or 5 sections throughout the day. And I'm feeling like that's more useful. But so I guess I just want to hear what you feel about like how should I approach not having done any like 80s sections, and my dislike for full practice tests, but the fact that they're necessary.
Sure, sure. So you don't need to, how should I put this? Like, you don't necessarily need to do more than 4 or 5 sections in a day.
Mm-hmm.
Like, yes, if you were doing individual sections with a break after every single one, maybe you could do 8, maybe you could do 10. But then do you have enough time to review all 8 or 10 of those sections in enough depth?
Mm-hmm.
To me, the value of doing this material is primarily in getting things wrong or having difficulty with things so that your review is targeted to exactly what you need to be working on.
Mm-hmm.
So to me, it's not necessary to do more than 4 or 5 in a day, nor would I necessarily want you to. I wouldn't want you to run the risk of burnout. And maybe you're more likely to burn out doing 2 exams back to back on the same day or consecutive days than doing 8 sections with frequent breaks. But again, I don't necessarily need that you to do a lot of volume of questions, especially in these final few weeks. There is that idea or that motivation to want to cram it all. And maybe you want to cover all of the exams in the 80s before the 25th.
That's not going to happen.
But it doesn't need to.
Yeah.
I would say a compromise might be a good approach where you do 1 timed exam per week.
Mm-hmm.
And then the rest of the week, you're doing individual sections or drilling questions by type, and then, of course, reviewing everything.
Okay. So that will mean like 3 or 4 practice tests about if you had to pick which number PTs you think I should do. Do you have like which ones you think would be best?
Yeah, I would actually say do the ones, do all the even numbered ones and save the odd numbered ones for a potential retake.
Odd. Okay. That's a good strategy. Okay. And then I guess another question I had was just sort of what your general advice is about review. And right now, I'll just tell you what I'm doing, and you can sort of let me know if that's a good or a bad approach. With logic games, I'm watching like online videos about it, and I'm waiting until I fully understand the mistakes I made and everything. But then once I do that, I don't go back and redo the whole game. I just sort of, because there are so many games, I feel like I'm benefiting more from like a new game rather than repeating games. But I'd like to hear what you think about that.
There's value in both. So it's kind of like a both and sort of thing where, yes, it's good to redo games. It's also to do new games. So I'd say redo games when you would find it useful.
Okay. And then same with logical reasoning. I'm not keeping a list of, I should have done this because I read Ellen's Loophole book, but I did not keep a list of the ones that I got wrong I didn't really, well, I guess I did have somewhat of a list of it, but I don't really revisit them just because I'm finding that like drilling by like learning the mistake that I'm making and then trying it on new material is how I'm going to tell if I've corrected that mistake. But if I'm just going back to these old questions, they're already familiar and I already know the answer. So I can't tell if I've actually absorbed the correction or not. Is that like okay? Or
yeah, I get what you're saying. I think that if you can maximize the period of time you put it away before looking at it again, so it's less fresh, then maybe you'll get more value out of looking at it a second time.
Okay.
But I agree, of course, especially with logical reasoning or reading comp. Once you've seen it, and in a certain sense, it's done.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. And then my last question, I think, is mostly about what your predictions might be for the November test in general.
Sure. Honestly, I don't really make too many predictions. That's not the game I'm in. I would rather just you be ready for anything and everything. The biggest predictions I would say are rather unexciting. I would suspect there's going to be a rule substitution question on the game section, since there has been on nearly every exam since number 57 or 58. I would also predict that there's likely to be some sort of curveball. Those have shown up fairly frequently. And so doing the list of curveball games would be a good idea, but I don't really make predictions beyond that.
Okay. That actually brings up another question about rule substitution questions in games. Do you think if I don't have the clock sort of showing, I guess this isn't super useful, but if I did have the clock showing, do you think that's a question I should, if it's the last question of a particular game, should I skip and move on so that I can get to more games, or should I like focus on finishing that up like we were talking about earlier of like it takes so much time to commit to the rules of each game, you should really try and get every question?
Rule substitution questions actually aren't that hard. They only seem hard because you encounter them so infrequently.
Yeah.
But if you were to, as a drill, do several rule substitution questions in a row, then you would start to see the patterns in terms of what they look like, what the correct answers look like, and how they construct these. And so I have a list of them as well. You can email me for it, of every single rule substitution question from exam 57 or 58 up to present, and just do all of them in a row, or at least do several in a row, and you'll see what they tend to look like. Someone who's never seen the LSAT before actually wouldn't think they were so bad because they're just asking you for what is equal.
Mm-hmm.
They're not actually doing anything new. So which one of the choices would be a perfect substitute giving you identical inferences? So you want something where all previous valid scenarios would still be valid, and they also would not allow anything new that previously would not have been permitted.
Okay, that's great.
So simply go through those games and do only the rule substitution question for each immediately after doing the setup.
Yeah, okay, and just sort of like get used to like the type of inferences and the type of like way of approaching those types of games. Yeah, okay, I'll definitely email you about those two things. Then my last question, this is kind of like a silly question, but I'm really torn about whether to look at my October score on November 20th, which is like before I take this test, or if I should just like put it out of sight and out of mind and just focus on November.
Sure. Well, that's a tough one.
Yeah.
Yeah, the LSAC, the more frequent test dates kind of throws everyone for a loop.
Yeah.
I don't have an answer on that, honestly. This is something so new, I haven't even really given it a ton of consideration. I would just go with whatever will put you in a better position to do well in November.
Okay.
Now, I can't imagine not looking at it for 5 days, but if you would find a low score discouraging, then of course don't. On the other hand, if you would find a low score or a high score motivating, then on the other hand, look.
Okay. Good to know. Well, this was really great. Thank you so much for all of your help.
My pleasure, of course, Lisa. What would you say is the biggest insight you got from our call today?
I think I really feel excited to try more rule substitution questions and curveball logic game questions. So I feel like your advice to focus on doing those types of questions and to make sure I feel more comfortable with curveball questions is really good advice. I think that's definitely how I'm going to spend a decent amount of time. And I also thought that your advice about only doing 3 to 4 PTs is like helpful, because that was something I was really struggling with about how many I should do.
Great. Awesome. Well, please keep in touch and let me know if you need anything and all as you move forward.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for tuning into the show. Please subscribe if you haven't done so already to be notified of new episodes as I release them. And feel free to reach out if you need anything at all as you move forward with your prep. I'm happy to help however I can. In the meantime, I'll wish you all the best and take care.